Good evening, everyone. This is Doug Cook, your host for tonight. I'm the Education Events Coordinator for NOFA Mass. Before we get started, I'd like to thank all of the NOFA Mass board and staff who've contributed in the production of this webinar. It's the third in a series of 5 events focusing on improving your pastures and products with intensive grazing practices. Also, we'd like to thank our grant funders, the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation Green Pastures Fund, to preserve and encourage small community-based agricultural ventures in the Berkshires, and to our sponsor, Organic Valley. You can learn more about the Organic Valley Co-op at organicvalley.coop. And most importantly, we'd like to thank you, the viewers and listeners, especially our members, who make our education and advocacy work possible. If you find this event useful and inspiring, become a NOFA Mass member or make a donation to support our important work. I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers. Michael Gallagher is a Berkshire County native. He went to Williams College and taught math in the Mississippi Teacher Corps for a few years before coming back to apprentice on diversified organic farms in New York and Vermont, and then returned to the Berkshires to start Square Roots Farm. And Connor is an ecological designer, farm business planner, and educator in Hatfield, Massachusetts. As principal at Appleseed Permaculture, he works with farm businesses and organizations around the Northeast, seeking to adopt industry-leading climate mitigating practices with a specialty in agroforestry enterprises and diversified annual and perennial operations. He is also an instructor at UVM's Innovative Leadership for Sustainability program.
Hi, everybody. This is Michael.
Hey, everybody. Connor here.
So that there was Square Roots Farm. That video was taken about at the end of May. So, Michael, I'll have you introduce yourself.
Great. Yeah, we're in Lanesborough, which is all the way out in the western end of the state, the next town north of Pittsfield. We are farming on about 185 acres, which we bought 8 years ago. We've been leasing for 3 years before we bought this place. So we've been here for 8 years. We are raising beef, 100% grass-fed, pastured poultry, layers, broilers, and turkeys, pastured pork, and we're doing about 2 acres of vegetables too, which is not what we're going to be talking about today. And so we're grazing, I said we have 185 acres, but we're really only grazing about 55 acres of that. The rest is all wooded and steep. And that's about where we are. We direct market probably 85% of that. We have a few small stores that carry eggs, and a few restaurants that do eggs and chickens, but 80 to 85% of everything we sell, we're direct marketing.
Maybe we could start off by talking about the different types of animals. Obviously, you've have the laying hens and 2 different styles of enclosure, and maybe we'll start there.
Yeah, absolutely. We ran, I think like a lot of other people, we ran like 200 or 300 laying hens for years. And when we were getting ready to welcome our second child, who was born in July, we really realized we couldn't keep the vegetable CSA up. And when we realized that, we said we have this big income chunk to replace, and decided that what we were going to replace it with was a flock of about 1,000 laying hens. we saw that there was a pretty clear market opening for somebody to move that volume of eggs, and that it was going to be a better fit with our schedule and staffing levels at that time. And so the first large-scale layer house we built was our skid house. It's like a scissor truss style skid house, which has a lot of roosting space. It means that basically all the trusses are like, they're made from like 20-foot 2x6s in an X. There's 7 of them, 4 feet apart, down the length of the house, and they all have little 2x2 roofs on both layers. So it had a ton of roosting space, which was one of the things we had never found like we had enough of in our egg mobiles. We had automatic bellwethers hanging down one side, feeders hanging down the other side, and sort of a plank running down the middle on the top layer, with nest boxes on either side. And that house was on 4x6 skids. And yeah, there were a lot of things that were great about that house. We could fit a lot of chickens in there. The chickens were very happy. We could move it. It took like 70 horsepower and 4-wheel drive to move it, especially when it's a little wet. And we moved it through a pasture that was about 10 acres. We had to widen all our gates because it was already subdivided for the cows. But once we widened the gates, we just sort of snaked it back and through. And that worked great for a couple of years. This year we decided to go a little more high tech, and we bought like a pre-built layer house from some folks out in Pennsylvania with all the bells and whistles, the automatic open and close nest boxes, the rollout nests onto a belt where you just stand outside and crank the belt and the eggs all come out. The grain bin on the back with the automated feeders, and, you know, nipple waters inside. And, you know, the thing we were really excited about that, besides all the labor saving stuff, was that we'd be able to, it's fully enclosed, again, like our egg mobiles were, so we can actually go out at night, catch the chickens that haven't decided to roost in there and toss them in, and then move it across the farm or across the road or to a non-adjacent parcel. So that gives us a lot more flexibility. With a big house, we were only able to move adjacent because there was no way to close the birds in. And we don't close them in at night regularly because we're running livestock guardian dogs with them. So we don't generally have to go out at night, which is great because we're usually too tired. And we just snapped our big skid house in half last week. So we're in the process of figuring out what we're going to replace that with.
Oh, what happened?
Well, one of our apprentices was moving it. One of the things we love about both of those houses is that anybody can move them. If you can drive a tractor, you can move the houses. But the skid got caught in kind of a deep rut from a few years ago when it was really wet, and caught in the rut on its way around a corner. Mm-hmm. And it sort of sheared a bunch of the vertical supports right off the skid. So we could fix it, but because it's not exactly because we're looking for more flexibility in the ability to move them non-adjacently and over more different parts of the farm, we're not going to fix it, and we are in the process of building something new.
Right. So do you think what are you leaning towards? What's your new style going to be?
We just picked up an old 32-foot camper. And so we're going to try using 2 big old campers. We haven't found the other one yet. Got them both, and one is going to be all roosting space, and one is going to be all nesting space. That's going to let us close the birds out of the nest boxes when we collect eggs in the evening. We'll put an auto opening door on there to open it up in the morning to let them in, so that we can have cleaner eggs. We've had we've been using the hen gear nest boxes. And the hens can figure, if you just close the roosting bar, the hens figure out how to open them up, and they get in there and sleep and poop in there at night. So we're hoping to have a dedicated nesting house and a dedicated roosting house.
We saw some of the fencing that you used. Could you speak a little bit more about what you've settled on for fencing?
Yeah, we love high tensile electrified fencing, and we've been chipping away at it ever since we bought the farm. It's not the kind of farm where we bought it and had all the money right away to do all the infrastructure that we wanted to do and did it all at once. And that's probably a good thing because we would have done it wrong because we didn't know exactly what we wanted or needed. We started out building 4-strand fence because we were raising sheep at the time. So we were putting up 4-strand high tensile fence. Switched to 3-strand when we got rid of the sheep and went to cows for perimeter fence. And we used single-strand interior fence to break up the pastures into smaller strips. For moving the cows, breaking it up into strips is great. It gives us a lot of flexibility. We run polywire between the 2 sides of any strip, and we've got water lines going under, for the most part, under every other interior fence, so that every strip you can access water either on one side or the other. So that gives us the flexibility to move the cows in really tight, close areas when we need to, and also to give them larger areas when that fits more with our goals. Right now, we're moving them twice a day in very small paddocks, like about 1/4 of an acre for like 30 head of cows. And we're doing that in front of hen moves right now, so that we don't have to mow. We use poultry net. I think you could see that in the video. We use poultry net for all of the birds, and when we run poultry net with high grass, especially this time of year, we end up with a lot of birds out. So we use the cows to really trample everything and take everything down in front of the birds when we can get them there, so we don't have to mow. And other times we'll move the cows in bigger areas and more quickly and leave a lot of residual to try to build up stockpile. Most years we can graze until almost Christmas. Last year was because of the dry fall, we started feeding hay around Thanksgiving, but usually we aim to graze until Christmas, and sometimes a little later if we don't have heavy snow.
Mm-hmm. Could you mention how many you have in your herd?
We've got about 30 head altogether. We just had calf born 2 days ago, so it's about 30. I don't quite keep track of all the comings and goings. We've got 2 going to the butcher in a week, but it's right around 30 at the moment. We're raising Devons. We've got purebred Devons that we're breeding, but you could see in the video we've got other cows in there. We don't have a big enough herd to meet all our needs for what we can sell for beef, so we're also buying in some feeder animals from some other farms in the area. So you can see a couple of Herefords and a couple of Angus crosses in there as well. But what we're breeding are purebred Devons for their marbling on grass.
And you also raise broiler hens. How many broilers do you raise every year?
This year's a big jump for us. We are doing a little north of 8,000 meat birds this year. And a big part of that is we started raising birds for Walden Local, which they run like a aggregate meat CSA in like Boston, New York, and Connecticut. So we raise birds for them, but we also raise our own birds and slaughter them for our own sales. So we just took 800 birds up to them on Monday morning, actually. And then we slaughtered 125 here on Tuesday. We've got another 125 to slaughter next week. So they just keep coming.
Do you take live birds to Walden? Is that what you?
Yeah, we take live birds to Walden. That was sort of the impetus behind developing that relationship. Was we were at a point where we felt like we could raise more birds. We're, fairly good at raising meat birds. We didn't feel like we could slaughter a lot more birds from a labor perspective, and also from a regulatory perspective. We're sort of capped in Massachusetts at 2,500 birds a year to slaughter on farm. So we thought, how can we raise more birds without having to slaughter more birds? And that was a good fit for us.
Mm-hmm.
Their only problem with it is that we dropped them at their slaughterhouse in Maine, so it's a 5-hour drive, and they have to be there at like 6:30 in the morning. So it's an overnight drive any way you do it, which is a great time for the birds to be driven, but it's not so great for the farmers. So I don't know if we're going to keep doing that forever. But right now it's a good fit.
Right. And what type of shelters are you using for your broilers?
Yeah, this has been a while in the making. This is probably the 3rd or 4th revision of our broiler shelters. Our broilers are in a day range system, so they're not enclosed in pasture pens, not like the Joel Salatin type pens. These are, what are they, 12 by 16 pens, and they're hoop pens. We bend top rail with a hoop bender, but they're low. They are only 3 feet tall in the center, which is plenty tall enough for chickens, but not the kind of thing I want to crawl into. And they're small enough that we can move them by hand. So every morning we go out and we move the pens by hand. They've got 2 bell waterers hanging inside the pens, attached to a bucket on the back, which is attached to a float valve, which is attached to our whole watering system, which I'm sure I'll talk about a little later. They're all on automatic water. We use 50-pound range feeders so they don't ever run out of feed. And we move the pen forward one pen length every day inside poultry netting lanes. So the different age groups are all together, but they're separated by poultry net. So each group has their own pen with their own lane. And we move them forward every day. And at the end of the week, we've gotten to the end of the lane. We take the poultry net down, move it, put the poultry net back up, and they're good to go for another week.
As you also raise pigs, do you want to mention some of how you raise your pigs?
Yeah, I can talk about the pigs a little bit. The pigs we use mostly as a tool in revamping old pastures that have been in pretty rough shape. So we have one pasture in particular we ran pigs through for several years, and made some pretty good improvements. And now we're moving them sort of along field edges, clearing out, just on the other side of the fence in a couple different places. We're moving those guys with netting too. We used to use 2 strands of polywire, but we have found that the Premier hog netting is just a little bit simpler, and especially simpler for anyone to use. It's just harder to screw it up. So we use that. We use just a bulk feeder. We just got a new one because we broke our last one last year. So it's just a big feeder that holds about a ton of feed. And when it's empty, we move the pigs. And, we found that to really get pastures, to really actually make a difference with pastures, the pigs make a big difference. But if we can't follow them, like within 6 months with the cows, then we sort of lose the progress we made with the pigs in terms of like, we go back to the perennial weeds we've had. We've had, we have like 6 and 7 foot tall goldenrod areas, and those, the pigs knock them down and then the grass comes up. But if we don't get in there with the cows, then the goldenrod will just come back up and overtop the grass. So they really work together to do that job.
Yeah, that's a good point. So over the 8 years, you've used different animals in different pastures for different goals, it sounds like. Have you had some overarching goals that you are specifically focused on your farm?
I mean, our big goal with all the animal groups is to keep them moving, and we've seen a lot of growth in terms of the forage quality and quantity, both of those over the time we've been here. We have one small pasture by the house, and our, just sort of an example, our neighbor used to hay it. And when we first bought the place, I said, asked him if he was going to come the year we were in the process of buying it, if he was going to come and make a second cutting of hay. And he said he never came over to do a second cutting because it never grew back enough to do a second cutting. And that's what we found with a lot of the farm, was that because it was sort of all like year to year lease with a hodgepodge of different neighbors, nobody had any real incentive to take care of it because they didn't know if they were going to be here the next year or not. So, they hate it, but they didn't add any fertility of any kind. They were just taking the hay off every year. And by the time we had been here for 2 or 3 years, we were getting 5 grazings out of that field, moving pretty quickly through there. So we're getting a lot more forage and a lot better quality forage. We're still working. There's still some things we're trying to work out, particularly this time of year with the big spring flush, and how we can keep ahead of that without making hay, which is still a puzzle we're working on. But we're figuring some of it out.
Right. I did notice that it looked like you were mowing ahead of your chickens this spring.
Yeah, there are some times when it makes more sense for us to mow in front of them than to bring the cows in and trample it hard. I don't like mowing. I don't enjoy driving around in circles, and I think the cows do a better job when I can get them over there. Sometimes it's just kind of impossible that they're just all the way on the other side of the farm, and we don't have the ability to move them all the way back across the farm to hit like one paddock for the chickens and then bring them back. So sometimes we mow, and we do find that there's sometimes where it's appropriate for us to clip after the cows. The area the cows are in now, we're absolutely going to mow once they're out because it's got a lot of nettles in it, nettles and thistles. So we're going to mow that down when they get out. But in general, we don't mow that often, and we try to have the cows do that work for us when we can.
And we're going to start speaking a little bit about silvopasture, and I wanted to hear your thoughts. Why are you interested in introducing more trees into your pastures?
Oh, yeah. So one part of that, well, I guess the biggest part of it is that we want to capture carbon and remove carbon from the atmosphere in trees. And silvopastures, I'm sure Connor will talk about, is one of the best ways to do that. You know, we saw it when we were reading Project Drawdown. It's like number 8 or 9. It's in the top 10 somewhere. Ways to combat climate change, and so that's really the most important thing. But it could fit into our farm in a lot of ways. The way we're most hoping to utilize it is to help to even out our forage growth. By putting some shade out there, we're trying to spread out. We have mostly cool season grasses like everybody else here, and we want to try to keep more of them growing during the hot part of the summer and sort of slow them down a little bit in the spring flush so that we can balance our forage growth a little better and try to match it better with our demand from the cows. So the shade also is a big factor for us. We're grazing, most of what we're grazing is pretty open fields. We don't have a lot of shade. So having some dispersed shade certainly would give us better livestock performance and comfort. But we've just sort of been hesitant to get started on it. It's the kind of thing you want to start right away because it's going to take a long time to get going. But it's also the kind of thing we felt like we were just always not quite ready to start because we wanted to get it right, because they're going to, you know, when we plant trees, they're going to be here for a long time. So we've had that pull and push going on, but we're really hoping to be able to do something and get some trees in the ground soon.
Mm-hmm. Great. Sounds like a good segue over to Connor, and I will relinquish my screen and give Connor the screen.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much, Michael. That was great to hear more of your process and how you're managing things there. Michael, if you're open to it, I may want to call on you a couple of times to ask you some questions further about what you're doing.
Absolutely.
Great. So, you know, as Michael was pointing to, I'm going to do a really kind of big picture introduction to what silvopasture is, what tree fodders are, why we might use them, and some of the management implications and kind of operational implications of adding trees to pastures. You know, as I want to put this in the context of agroforestry, of tree-based farming, and the big diversity of ways that trees can be incorporated into farm production, can be incorporated into commercial operations, whether as crops themselves, as kind of infrastructure in a sense, living infrastructure, like with a lot of silvopasture systems, or some of these more complex multi-strata tree-based production systems. You know, and as Michael was saying, silvopasture is one of the very top globally relevant carbon farming practices. So there's a little bit of science behind that. People, I'm going to trust, are familiar with the magnitude of the math that we face around climate change. I'm not going to review that too much right now. But just to give you a basic image, we're globally, you know, there's a little dip right now from the pandemic, but it's going to come roaring back, man. Watch out. Globally, there's about 10.5 billion tons of carbon emitted per year, and there are about 4.5 billion tons resequestered into the, about 6 billion tons resequestered into the land and oceans. There's a net about 4.5 billion tons added to the atmosphere, which is why the carbon dioxide parts per million keep going up and up and up and up and up. So that gross emissions number needs to come way down, and that gross sequestration number needs to come up so that we get to net zero and then net negative. That's one of the biggest projects of our lifetimes to prevent future climate atrocities. So, this is silvopasture is one of the biggest ways for agriculture to participate in that. So just a little bit of math here. The bulk of global research is that you store about from somewhere between 0.3 and 0.5 tons of carbon per acre per year on average through managed grazing. Now, there are a handful of studies in North America that have shown much higher sequestration rates in the 1 to 1.8 tons of carbon per acre per year from the type of intensive holistic grazing that's happening at Square Roots Farm. What's unclear from that research so far is how consistently achievable those levels of sequestration are on all sites and all operations and by all operators. They may represent kind of best case scenario outcomes across the industry. But there is beginning to be some evidence and some more evidence that kind of higher than global average levels of carbon storage can be done just through kind of the best in industry grazing systems alone. Now, it's also worth remembering that we have to offset those numbers in our minds by about 0.2 tons of the equivalent amount of carbon per acre per year because of methane emissions from ruminants. So now if we add trees to these intensive rotational managed grazing systems, and it should hopefully be clear, but you can probably imagine why, that you have to be doing the kind of careful rotational grazing that Michael's talking about and practicing. You have to be doing that level of rotation if you're incorporating animals and trees together. Because if you don't do that, you're going to lose the investment in the trees through concentrated animal impact on that ground. And so you won't get the long-term benefits of shade access and fodder production and other things from the trees. So they really good silvopasture tree fodders and rotational grazing really go hand in hand. So doing a pasture to silvopasture conversion, which is adding shade and fodder trees to pastures, you get up to an average of 2 to 2.5 tons of carbon stored per acre per year. And you continue to store carbon in the above ground wood of the trees beyond the point where the soil carbon reaches an equilibrium, which is usually about 20 to 30 years of improved practices. So this is a really compelling carbon farming system. And if you combine the kind of per acre potential of adding trees to pastures with the amount of land in the world that it's applicable to, you get it's modeled as the #1 global agricultural climate solution by Project Drawdown. The total global potential of this is higher than any other single farming practice. So that's really exciting, and it's really applicable to where we are in New England and the Northeast. We have a land base that, we have some of the most amazing agricultural soils in the world in the Connecticut River Valley. There's some coastal soils in Maine that are really, really productive for tillage crops. But a lot of our region, we have soils that are based on glacial till, and they're really good at growing grass, and they're really good at growing trees. So this is a combination of grass and trees. And to give you an image of how that looks and how that works, just to say a few things about the effect of shade on animals like Michael is speaking to. Couple of bits of research, because this is focused on beef cattle, the same kind of operation we're talking about, not even adding in the benefits of the complex lead follow system that's being discussed here. There are weight gain effects of having access to shade in the late spring and early summer from a study in Kentucky. As much as an additional pound of weight gain per day from shade access, and you can just imagine the physiological stress of full sun heat exposure compared to under shade. There are significantly improved conception rates of cattle under shade in silvopastures from studies in Florida, 44% compared to 25% without shade. And there are significantly improved pregnancy rates in a study in Missouri, almost 90% pregnancy rate compared to 50% without shade. So I think you can just see from these glimpses of the research that the access to shade makes a major difference in the health and quality of life of the animals. And that translates both into their experience as living beings and also into the viability of the farm. So essentially, adding trees to pastures is an investment in farm viability for grazing operations. And as Michael was saying, it takes a number of years to mature. So it's a capital investment in a sense. So how does silvopasture work? Well, just to give you an image of what we're talking about, one of the really big variables in silvopasture is the canopy cover. And so what we're not talking about is 100% canopy cover with trees, because once you reach beyond somewhere around 60% canopy cover, you are losing the light conditions in which it's possible to grow forages. And so this is not about reforesting pasture fully, and it's also not about just putting animals in the woods. This is about aiming for generally somewhere in this 25 to 50% canopy cover range. And where you are in that spectrum determines a number of things. It determines your forage production, determines some of those, some of those preferencing early season versus mid-season versus late season growth effects that Michael was talking about, even can affect what species of forages are going to do best on your site. It also significantly affects how the trees are going to grow. So there's a lot of questions you want to think through if you're planning a silvopasture conversion that have to do with your goals for the overall system. We'll look at a little bit of that too. So here's some more graphics, kind of giving you a felt sense of different canopy cover percentages. So on the left we have, these are 1 acre squares. So on the left we have about 13 to 15 trees per acre at 60-foot spacing between trees. So this is about a 15 to 18% canopy cover. Here we have the same size, these are mature, relatively mature trees. 40-foot spacing gets you up to 35 to almost 40% canopy cover. So that's tree spacing is one of the big things. And then now you might think, well, gosh, how am I going to protect each individual tree? And this is one of the big questions about silvopasture establishment is the cost of fencing and the management complexity of managing animals around fencing, because you have to invest in protecting the trees until they're mature enough to hold their own against cattle. So what we've been really moving towards in recent years, the community of kind of researchers and practitioners and farmers around the Northeast who's been really focusing on silvopasture conversions. We've really been moving towards establishment and management in alleys of trees rather than in a kind of full, evenly distributed pattern. And I'll show you some of the kind of establishment techniques in a minute. But so this is, again, looking at, this is 80-foot row spacing on the left, 60-foot row spacing in the middle, 40-foot row spacing on the right. Again, these are 1 acre squares. And, this range from 20 to 50% canopy cover equivalent. So we have rarely seen it makes sense, except in some small livestock or pastured poultry situations, to go tighter than 40-foot row spacing in these silvopasture alleys, in part because you start to edge towards that 60% canopy cover where you're losing some grass production, but also because a lot of animals behaviorally are just not as happy and willing with these narrow grazing alleys. And Michael, I'd be interested to hear your perspective in the quarter-acre blocks that you manage in, kind of what the sort of minimum width that you found you need to provide is, because that's one of the variables. And another variable is that depending on how much grass you have available on the property and how much animal unit livestock you have available to eat that grass, you may need to do supplemental mowing in addition to grazing in certain silvopasture situations. And so then you want to think about the practicalities of the mower and the width of the mower for how to do it efficiently. Same with adding trees to hay lands, which we've been increasingly experimenting with doing also. So do you want to say anything about grazing alley width, Michael, in your experience?
So our strips are mostly 150 feet wide and we picked that really to run with our poultry nets, which are 160 feet. So we wanted to be able to put like one poultry net from one side to the other. And those, when we're putting the beef really tightly, we're giving them, they actually have less room in the other way like down to like 60 feet, and we haven't had any issues with that, with them, you know, not liking it or busting out of it.
Cool. Okay, that's helpful to picture. Yeah. So, you know, 160 feet is, if that was the width of the rows, again, for silvopasture purposes, that would likely be too wide to have a meaningful shade benefit across the pasture. But 60 foot is a very viable width to get some shade benefit and get some carbon storage in the trees. So these are some of the things you have to think through in advance, is what are the management implications going to be of the spacing that you choose to use. And so here's one of the ways we've found that is really effective for establishing silvopastures. So basically, now this is not to scale. This is a conceptual drawing here. So you imagine you have your grazing paddock. Establishing trees have to be really effectively protected from animal access. And so, you know, at first you're able to just have your grazing alley between those alleys of trees. And we often give about a, you know, 2, sometimes 3 foot buffer on either side of the trees, which then needs to be scythed or mowed or weed whacked, or, you know, vegetation managed there in some way. Now, so this is often in the first 5 or 6 years. And then once these initial trees are mature enough, then you can actually double the quantity of trees in the pasture and increase the shade and carbon by going back in and establishing a new strip of trees in between the original ones and giving the animals access to the original ones at this point. The 5-year or 6-year mark isn't important here. What's important is when the trees are ready for animal impact. And so I want to shift, we don't have a ton of time here. I want to shift to talking about some species of trees that can be kind of most effectively added to pastures, and then we'll go into some question and answer. So, you know, there's hundreds of species of trees that can grow in this climate. Any of them could theoretically be used, but what we've been trying to do is hone in on the species that we feel really confident in based on seeing them demonstrated, seeing them work in managed silvopasture grazing systems repeatedly. And so there's maybe a short list of 10 or 12 species that we feel fairly confident in, and there's really a short list of 4 or 5, maybe 6 species that we're really focusing on as the starter set for this region. So I wanted to walk you through a few of those. And I wanted to see, this is where I can't see the chat, but so maybe people can shout it out. Oh, great, thanks Doug. Maybe people can shout it out. I want to quiz you a little bit on some of these species. So who's this here? What is this? Which species does this look like to you all?
Someone guessed black locust.
Bingo, yes, black locust. Yes, now this is currently an illegal tree in the state of Massachusetts, but God willing, that'll change. Doesn't make any sense to have this tree be banned. It's based on a really deep misunderstanding of the glacial history of our region and how species are continuing to move north over time, including this one. So, but if you live in New York or most other states in the region, this is a tree we can work with. And so what's really remarkable about black locust for this purpose is its multifunctionality. One of the things about it is it's really fast growing. Another thing about it is it's really drought tolerant. And so it's very amenable to establishment with no irrigation. People are experiencing a lot of drought this year right now. And a third thing about it is it is the only species of tree in this region right now that has a timber market at small diameters. So there's a limited but real market for black locust fence posts. And those are harvested between 8 and 12 years of age. So that's decades earlier than you would be harvesting marketable timber from almost any other species. And so it really can fit into grazing systems in a number of different ways. And the fourth thing is that it's a really high quality leaf fodder for animals. So that's just a pitch for thinking about black locust, you know, progressively in Massachusetts moving forward, and also in other states that some of you might be in. This is a locust goat silvopasture you can see here. But so let's look at another species. So who is this?
Cosmo's guessing poplar and willow.
Yep, poplar and willow. Yep. So this is members of the poplar family. So these are hybrid poplars on the left here, and then this is a basket willow species on the right here. So a lot of advantages to these as well. And one of them, again, is their growth rate. So these are the hybrid poplars and some of the willow species are the highest woody growth rate you're going to get in this climate. You know, in the humid tropics, you can grow a full-size tree in 2.5 years, but the closest we're going to get to that here are some of these species. They're a high-quality leaf fodder. Again, the willow has medicinal properties for a lot of animals. And they also, like the black locust, they coppice very easily. So if you're harvesting leaf fodder from them, then they'll regrow easily from that cut. Now, what about this one? I'll give you another hint. You'll get it when I give it to you, though. Let's see if anyone's got something. Here's the clue. All right, so mulberry. Now, it may surprise you to know that the primary, obviously there's a huge mulberry industry with the fruits in North Africa and Southwestern Asia and other parts of the Mediterranean. Big mulberry industry in China, but the biggest agricultural use of mulberry worldwide is for the leaf fodder production as a livestock feed. And so it is one of the highest protein leaf fodders for feeding animals and producing tree hay. So tree hay is a really old practice from all over the world, all over Europe, all over China, very rarely practiced in North America, where woody brush and tree leaves are harvested and actually baled, similar to hay bales, and they're stored for winter fodder. So, this is one of the numerous applications of tree fodders. They can be cut and fed fresh, but they also can be cut and baled and dried and stored for the winter. I just wanted to give you an image of tree hay because most people haven't ever seen it. There's not a lot of working examples of that. But mulberry is really one of our strong silvopasture trees because of its fodder quality. Not as fast growing as black locust or poplars or willows. So it takes a bit more time and patience to mature and develop. Now, who's this one?
Cosmo knows, Eric knows, it's honey locust.
Honey locust, yeah. So in this case, honey locust gets to be a really tall tree. And in this case, the fodder production here is not from the leaves, but it's from the pods. So the fruit of the honey locust is a protein-rich, calorie-rich food that cattle will graze on, sheep will graze on, pigs will graze on. And so there's ways to have honey locust as kind of an overstory standard tree over some of these smaller trees that you might be coppicing or pollarding for their fodder production. So, and just to say too, there's ways to do silvopasture that don't have anything to do with fodder production, but I wanted to give you some of these examples because the multifunctionality of these tree plantings is one of their real benefits to adding to grazing systems. Couple images of specialized applications. Actually, you know what we really have to do with these last few minutes? We got to switch to Google Earth because I got to show you the farm. So here is the kind of region and neighborhood of Square Roots Farm. Very interesting to see. And now we're going to zoom in on property. So there we go, both sides of the road. And we are now going to take a look at a particular pasture that Michael and I talked about that might be potentially a place to start with adding trees for a silvopasture. So I know you're on the phone, Michael, but we're zooming in on that pasture we talked about. And I'm actually going to bring up contour lines so people can see the topography. So these are 1 meter contour lines. This is 3 1/3 feet contour lines that we've got up here. And you can see that it's a pretty even slope on this field going down from, let's see here, going down from basically west, little northwest to east, little southeast. But it's pretty steep as well. Not as steep as the cliff that's above it, a little to the west. And now we're going to bring up some soils. So we have a let's see here. We have a Peru Marlow Association soil is the bulk of this pasture. And then we have a little bit of a Berkshire Marlow Association, extremely stony. Both of these are called extremely stony soils. And in fact, if you look at the soil horizons here, you hit glacial till at about 1.5 foot of depth, 1.5 to 2 feet of depth. And so one of the big questions when you're looking at silvopasture establishment, you have to think about not just the conditions for forage production, but the conditions for tree establishment and tree growth as well. And so in this case, we have a relatively even planed slope. There's not a lot of convexity or concavity, but you have a rocky soil, relatively steep, that's relatively shallow, not to bedrock here, but to glacial till. So that soil depth and those conditions are going to tell you that we're going to need a set of tree species here if we're adding trees that are going to be resistant and resilient to these conditions. Trees that can grow on steeper slopes, trees that can grow in shallower to resistant layer soils, and potentially trees that can be completely dry farmed with no watering because of the location on the farm. Now there are trees that can do that, and so one of the applications that could work here would be a chestnut silvopasture. Chinese chestnuts are a crop that's being developed as a new tree crop for the Northeast, and it's a kind of an industry that I'm involved in working on the development of, and they are well adapted to this kind of site compared to other trees. So they're very drought resistant, they grow well in shallow soils, and they fit well into silvopastures in the sense that they need wide spacing because of their size. So they adapt well to 40 to 60 foot spacing with alleys of chestnuts. Not the only species that would work well here. Honey locust would likely work well here. Black locust we have to leave off the list because of Massachusetts right now. But that's the universe of trees that we're talking about. We don't have the soil quality that would allow for things like willow or hybrid poplars to establish and grow well here in all likelihood. So we're going for these more drought tolerant species. And then, the establishment process, it would involve potentially a change in grazing management. And so this is something, we did a big silvopasture planting in a heifer pasture at Hawthorne Valley Farm nearby this spring, in a big social distanced planting team. And one of the things we were really looking at is reorienting the grazing pattern on that field to work along contour, because that way it's possible to establish the trees with contour and do some either strip tilling, or in this case, we subsoiled the field along contour to increase the water infiltration for the trees as a kind of passive irrigation strategy when we're in an unirrigated pasture. So that might be appropriate in this case. The rockiness of the soil may make strip tilling or subsoiling difficult. So they would take some on the ground inspection and soil test pits to think that through a little more fully. But this hopefully gives you an image of the types of questions that have to be asked when you're preparing for the possibility of a silvopasture conversion, and the way that you may need to actually plan for potentially a number of years of modified grazing management while the trees mature before you have kind of access to the full range of fencing geometries that you might have been using previously. Michael, do you want to add anything about this field in particular? And then I think we're going to shift into question and answer.
No, I mean, the reason that field sort of seemed like the most appropriate place to start for us is that we haven't put any interior fencing in there yet, as we've been building out our fencing infrastructure. It's just sort of, because it's sort of farther at the edge of things, we just have finished perimeter fencing it last year. So, and, because we don't run poultry in there that often because it's so far out, we just have a lot more predator pressure out there. So it's really just the beef out there. It seemed like the simplest place to start to think about it without having to think about what kind of poultry pens am I going to fit between trees. Yeah. And this would be a very simple tree layout in this field. Yeah. And can you usually protect trees like that with just a single strand of high tensile wire on each side? Yeah, we've often used 2-strand with cattle when we're guarding them, because we're guarding them for many years, many years while they mature. So I've seen some 1-strand setups, but more often 2-strand. Okay. So I think we're meant to transition into a bit of question and answer here. So I'm going to stop the screen share for now, but we can come back to that if people are having any questions that we want to look at the Google Earth map to address.
So folks, you can keep putting your questions into the chat function, and I'll start with some of that we've sort of touched on. Could you speak a little bit more about the grazing strategy that you would try to apply?
Right. Yeah. So usually we're grazing up to about 2 to 3 feet from the trees. We do that so that animals aren't like pushing their head through the fencing to get at the trees, and there's no danger of kind of being kicked or trampled from animals that are right along the fence. And also that width makes it easier to mow in between the fence lines. So there is a kind of a management time budget you have to think through around how to maintain the trees while they're growing. Certain species, for instance, if you are growing black locust for fence posts, there's a basic amount of limbing and pruning that you want to do to produce a relatively unbranched fence post bowl in that 8 to 10 year time period. So you need to be able to access the trees, and that 3 foot spacing generally makes that work well.
I think a lot of people are intrigued about planting on contour and
right.
are interested in hearing more about swales, perhaps, or would you do?
Yeah, I saw that in there. So for people who aren't familiar, swales are an earthwork where you're excavating a basin and then mounding a berm on the downhill side. And the basin can be very narrow, but it's helpful to think of it as a basin because depending on how it's angled, if it's exactly along contour, it's just going to catch and hold water. And then if it's slightly off contour, it's going to drain water in a particular direction. Now there's a whole engineering science and art around adding earthworks to pastures and how to design and construct them. It's a little beyond what we have time for here, but I guess what I want to say is that swales are appropriate in some situations and they're not as appropriate as other strategies in a lot of situations. And in general, some of the situations where swales can be really helpful are in drought-prone, heavier soils. So often that's siltier soils that are on a steep slope. So, and maybe they have a southern or western exposure, so they get really baked during high sun times of year or dry times of year. In those situations, you have the soil quality to store and hold water in the swale, and you also have the soil texture that allows the berm of the swale to kind of do its job really effectively. In very sandy soils, the berm of the swale may not hold as well, and you're gonna have a lot more blowouts in higher rain events versus in a heavier soil, it's gonna act more like a pond wall. There's simple scratch swales that you can make with a small excavator, kind of do it yourself if you know what you're doing. But depending on the volume of water that you're planning for, the size of rainfall or flood event that you're planning for, you may need to use a heavier piece of equipment. So there's some engineering around swales that you want to think through fully before implementing. And in a lot of cases, increasing infiltration through subsoiling or other forms of decompaction, like intensive cover cropping application, can be a better strategy to achieve what you're trying to achieve around water retention than a swale. So that's what I'd say in a basic sense about that.
And do you ever incorporate a variety of different species into the same row?
That's a good question. Sometimes there are management challenges of multi-species rows, multi-species alleys, and there are benefits too. There's biodiversity benefits, there's pest impact reduction benefits. Most of these species have very low pest pressure, but so there are benefits to that diversity, but the management challenges include those different species may have different growth forms and grow to different sizes. So we're trying to be really cautious about how quickly we push the envelope on this practice, because we want to really establish things that are going to really establish successfully and be able to be managed successfully for the long term, so that this is a really viable and accessible option for adding trees to farms. So more typically what we'll do is we will do single species rows that have diversity between the rows. So for instance, in the system we installed at Hawthorne Valley, we had a top of the pasture row in the driest section of chestnuts, and then we had 2 alleys of locust, and then we had a bottom alley in the wettest part of the pasture of mulberry. And the one kind of interspecies planting we're doing in between rows that I feel a little more confidence in is interplanting honey locusts as overstory standards over black locust, or in other systems, that would be over willow coppice or mulberry coppice. So because the honey locust is a fodder, is a pod fodder, a fruit fodder. It doesn't have to stay at a manageable height. It can just get really tall and then drop pods, but you don't want them to shade the pasture too much. So every so often you have a honey locust within some of those other species. Someone asked a question about pest issues with these tree species. You know, most of these tree species, they have a handful of pests that can have a high impact, but many fewer pests than the tree fruits we're used to. So there's a couple of boring insects that can be a challenge for chestnuts. You know, there's a couple of pests that can produce issues for mulberries, but mostly it's a much lower pest load than apples or stone fruits.
Mm-hmm. And Cosmo asked another question about your thoughts of which species you would choose to rotate through silvopastures and in what sequence.
Cool. Do you want to take that first, Michael, and I can add anything?
Yeah, I mean, for us, I think what it would look like would look like a lot like what things look like in our open pastures, which is we would bring the beef through first and we would bring the chickens through afterwards. The chickens really prefer the short grass, both because the chickens prefer it and because we prefer it in terms of getting their infrastructure set up and moved through. And they do a fair amount in terms of disrupting the pest cycle with the manure patties from the cows. So from the species we have on our farm, that's the way that we would do it. And yeah, I think if we had sheep instead of cows, it would be the same with it. You know, the sheep would go first and the chickens would go second.
Yeah, I mean, there are, to speak to that a little bit, there are definitely unique benefits as well as unique challenges of small ruminants in silvopastures. And so one of the big ones is the parasite management being a lot more challenging than with beef cattle or dairy cows. And so what that can sometimes mean is that to give pastures sufficient rest period to break those parasite cycles, it means that you have more grass than you're actually able to graze over the course of the year with small ruminants alone. So small ruminants they're really well suited to a multi-species grazing system. If they're your only species that you're using, and we've seen this in some of the orchard grazing systems we work in where beef cattle really aren't appropriate, at least with fruit orchards, we're really mainly working with sheep in those systems. But both because of the parasite issues and because of the food safety regulations, if you're certified organic, that you need often to have either like a really precisely measured and timed number of sheep for your grass, and then often you're still doing supplemental mowing. So it's helpful both to have non-silvopasture areas. So if in a fruit orchard grazing system, so that you can put them on that grass during the 60 or 90-day window, whichever one you're under, when you need them off before harvest. And it's also helpful to have other species so that you can make use of grass when it needs to rest for the small ruminants. And then of course, the other thing is that the amount of damage that sheep and goats can do through browsing to young developing trees is just as significant as the trampling damage that beef cattle or pigs can do. So you have to fence them really effectively. Now, the one thing I'll say that's an advantage of small ruminants is that they often eat a lot of the leaf fodders a lot more readily than cows will. So with black locust or sometimes poplar or mulberry systems, some of those trees aren't fully drought tolerant, but they're more drought tolerant than the grass is in a lot of cases. So you can have not a lot of green grass on your pasture, and you have a storage of fodder in the leaves of those trees, and so you can make it through short drought periods through the leaf fodder sometimes, kind of almost as a form of stockpiling. So that can be a kind of beneficial application of more diversity of fodder sources in the pasture. And then Eric asked where to learn more about alternative infiltration strategies to swales. It's so site and operation specific what the best solution might be, and depends on what the goals that you're holding are. So I hesitate to say, what the best strategy would be, but broadly, we're talking about, either mechanical strategies like subsoiling, or we're talking about, kind of purely cover crop based strategies. And so I think you'd want to talk to specialists in each of those strategies, or someone who's a specialist in all of them, and kind of evaluate what's the most cost effective and most effective strategy for your soils and your site. So, give me a call sometime and we'll hop on Google Earth and look at it, or come out to the farm. But it really requires a operation specific assessment. And there aren't a lot of great written resources about some of these strategies, unfortunately, yet. And someone was pointing to herbal blends for goats for parasite management. You still are going to need to give the pasture the rest period to kill off the parasites from the previous rotation. Those blends definitely aren't a substitute for that, but they can really help. And one of the interesting directions to go in with that is incorporating some of those kind of pharmaceutical herbs into the pasture forage mix itself. So diversifying generally it's the non-grass, non-forb, it's the herbaceous wildflower portion of the forage mix, which often is only 5 to 10% of the biomass at most. But that 5 to 10% contains a lot of really important botanical compounds and a lot of really important, nutritional diversity. So, things like, just to name a few, there's dozens, but things like chicory, and things like some other aster family members can play a big role in that. Comfrey, people are talking about a really good chicken fodder there also. And there's also an interesting thing about how the tree fodders themselves are a diversification of diet. And a lot of the woody fodders, they actually can do a similar function that seaweed, in some of this emerging research about seaweed fodder reducing methane emissions from belching in cattle, a lot of tree fodders can do the same thing. So there can be a emissions reduction effect of some of this fodder diversification, as well as the effect of the shade and other benefits of the trees.
And another question on my end: where do hazelnuts fit into a silvopasture system?
Hazelnuts, good question. Okay, let's talk about hazelnuts. So when you go to the store and buy hazelnuts, what you're buying is a European filbert that was grown in usually Oregon or Washington State, and that's a large size hazelnuts, really good flavor quality. East of the Rocky Mountains, there is a fungal disease called the Eastern filbert blight that produces 90+% mortality in European filberts. So they're completely unviable as a crop east of the Rocky Mountains. So what people have done, and there's now an emerging hazelnut industry in the upper Midwest, in Illinois, Wisconsin, southern Minnesota, they're using hybrid hazelnut genetics that are a bred cross between the wild Native American hazel and European filberts. So people call them hazelberts or hybrid hazels. That's what the Midwestern hazelnut industry is based on, and almost all of that production is for oil. It's for pressing into hazelnut oil. Little bit of fresh whole nut sales, but mostly we're talking about oil. So though the challenge is that those Midwestern genetics have not produced reliably in the Northeast. So, and one of the reasons for that is that although we're at the same hardiness zone, in terms of cold, we actually have a shorter growing season and we have less heat in that growing season than comparable hardiness zones in the Midwest. So, and a lot of that is because we have more precipitation, therefore more cloud cover during the growing season. So we are not getting consistent yields and production year to year with the Midwestern hazel genetics. So there's a breeding project at Cornell that's working on Northeastern hybrid hazels. The most interesting breeding project is probably at Rutgers, where they're working on blight-resistant European filberts for the Mid-Atlantic and edging into the Northeast. There's 20 farms that have those trial plantings now, from a half acre to an acre. Some of the farms I work with are a part of that. But the point being, we are a long ways away from a kind of genotypically stabilized production hazelnut for the Northeast. We're probably at minimum 10 years away from that. Maybe a little less if the Rutgers project really proves successful in the on-farm trials, the production is consistent, and then there's the ability to have, commercial production of the genetics that people can access. So Hazels they're a great bit of biodiversity. They have a lot of really interesting insect associations. They are a decent, although not great, leaf fodder. They're very drought resistant, so they have some qualities that are interesting from a silvopasture perspective. But as a nut orchard crop, they're not ready for our region. And I just want to let people know that if you're thinking about investing in hazelnuts, invest in them on an experimental basis, not on a commercial basis.
And as you mentioned, diversifying forage species, someone asked if there are any shade-tolerant legumes that you would recommend.
Yeah, so the level of shade that we're producing in silvopasture conversions it's a part shade environment, not a full shade environment. And so that when the part shade environment that you get in that 40 to 60% canopy cover range is sufficient for most of the forage legumes that we typically use. And then if you're below 40% canopy cover, you're basically in a full sun environment in most parts of the pasture with, moving dappled shade throughout the day. So you don't need to substantially shift your legume species in these systems. The bigger shift is in grass species, where a lot of the cool season sod grasses actually do better with part shade than they do with full sun. So it can be a benefit to the total grass production, especially in a dry year. However, the kind of high biomass producing warm season bunch grasses will not do as well under part shade. So you'll drop out some native species like big blue stem or Kentucky bluegrass or things like that, and you'll veer more towards some of the European sod grasses, like some of the fescues and some of the other kind of typical forage grasses we use.
Are there any particular methods that you would use to introduce new species into a pasture system like that?
Yeah, Michael, do you want to speak to how you've done kind of forage development over time?
I can speak a little bit to it, although we have not actually done any seeding of anything. We have grazed and we've rested, and we've seen loads of red clover coming back. We've seen some bird's foot trefoil, stuff that we didn't see in the first few years, but we've not done any seeding anywhere.
There's a whole science of seeding establishment in pastures, and the timing in the year is really precise. People often frost seed in February, March, early April, so that the freeze and thaw cycle can work the seed into the soil, because the challenging thing in especially a well-managed pasture is that there's very little bare soil. So the soil to seed contact is difficult to achieve. So sometimes people are using drill seeding. Sometimes they're scarifying, doing a very light surface harrow at a certain time of year and then seeding, sometimes even starting over with a whole new mix. One technique that's used a lot in silvopasture systems is bale seeding. So in that case, what you're doing is you're cutting hay from a hay field that has some of the species you want in it, and you're baling that. And sometimes that means you're cutting hay from one of your pastures, or cutting kind of stockpile hay from a pasture, and you're spreading that where you want to establish those species, and then you're sending the animals in the winter. So you're sending them in November, or December, or January in lower snow conditions, but with frozen or near frozen ground, letting them disperse the seed through feeding on the bales. And then they are also trampling and scattering and manuring and kind of helping basically make a seed bed for those seed to establish in. And so often we'll do an initial round of bale seeding when we're trying to improve the forage in a silvopasture, and then we'll kind of come through and do spot seeding in areas where it didn't come in as well.
Yeah, and Bob Richardson earlier this week mentioned he would cast seed in advance of his livestock coming through, and they would tramp it down.
That's cool. That's like another way to think about bale seeding. Yeah, doing it in time.
And Cosmo asked your thoughts on bird's foot trefoil and black medic as forage crops.
Yeah, I am a fan of bird's foot trefoil. I'm honestly not as familiar with black medic, so I can't speak to that one. But I definitely think bird's foot trefoil is worthwhile. What would you say to those species, Michael?
Yeah, the trefoil is great. I have not had any experience with the other one, so I don't have anything to say about that.
And a final question for both of you about the resources that you think people should be looking out to take advantage of.
Yeah, we've had a lot of success working with the NRCS for fencing, and we have another project with them this year to do a couple of stream crossings and some livestock trails. They've been really great.
And
I got a couple to add on the Silvopasture side. There's a book about Silvopasture now, which there was not until very recently. So the book is by Steve Gabriel from Cornell Small Farms Institute. It's called Silvopasture. So it's very easy to find. And I have an article in there about using keyline subsoiling for establishing silvopastures, silvopasture tree plantings. And I did some of the graphics and kind of chart calculations in the book. So you'll find me in a few places in there. And it's a really great book that deals with ecology and also deals with, a number of different silvopasture scenarios. Definitely worth taking a look at. There's a semi-active Silvopasture Facebook group where there's been some good conversation in. And there's also there's a real, actually, remember that old social network Ning, where you could make your own little micro Facebook basically? So there's a Silvopasture Ning that is still semi-active, and some of the researchers from Cornell and Yale and UVM and some other places have been active on there. So there's some kind of professional networks of people working with Silvopasture. We're also, before the pandemic, we were actually working on a regional strategy of coordinating across a lot of groups to kind of have a wave of work around Silvopasture demonstration and technical assistance and outreach in the whole region. So this was actually part of that wave, and so we'll have to adapt our strategy for that as we're not getting them together in person so much right now. But we do really think that this is a really crucial climate adaptive strategy as well as a carbon sequestration strategy because of the ability of shade to moderate temperatures and moisture level in pastures as our climate gets more erratic, as people were saying. But it's also one that there's not a lot of ability to see it working and living on farms. And so there's really understandable hesitancy to invest in the trees if you don't feel confident in it. So we're looking for a bunch of opportunities for where we can give people contact with working silvopasture systems and understand how they could be applied on their home farm.
And are there resources you would recommend for people looking to get started with a few species of plants, of tree species or cover crops, places where we should look for products like that?
What would you say on that front, Michael?
I mean, like I said, we haven't actually done any pasture seeding at all. So we've never bought pasture seed. We've found we have a lot of seed in our seed bank, a lot of diverse seed, and I think that as somebody's getting started, I think there are a lot more important things to spend money on than on seed and trying to get seed established, because you have seed, you have good seed, you have clover seed, you have grass seeds of all kinds in your seed bank, and it is way down the list on things to spend money on when you're getting started. But I don't know anything about where you'd buy trees.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would also say that trees are not your first priority either for spending money on. You need to get your grazing, your grass-based grazing system really working through fencing and management, and animal genetics first in most cases. And then once your grazing system is working well, then you're in a good position to add trees or to develop the forages more. And I also want to really recommend Sarah Flack's book, The Art of Grazing, or is it The Art and Science of Grazing? I've got it over here. It's really the best thing that's been published, I think, about these intensive grass-based systems. And Sarah is an amazing grazing educator and consultant out of Northern Vermont. So really recommend her work along these lines too.
Well, it's a little after 7. I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our grant funders tonight, the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation Green Pastures Fund. And thanks again to our sponsor, Organic Valley. Thank you again to you all for joining us. If you found this event inspiring and helpful, please consider becoming a member or making a donation to help us continue our important work. We have more online educational opportunities you may be interested in. Next Thursday, June 25th, we'll be hosting Will and Amelia Conklin of Skyview Farm to learn how they've used intensive grazing to restore old pastures and operate a small-scale milk dairy in the basement of their house, as well as a meat CSA. And then July 9th, Toffer Sabat at Cricket Creek Farm will speak about their cheese-making processes and intensive grazing practices as well. And NOFA's annual summer conference is going on for the first time from July 20th through June 9th, with over 60 workshops and events ranging from agroforestry, which Connor will be helping with, to vermicomposting. This year's virtual conference will not disappoint. Register today and sign up for this great opportunity to continue your education with more live events like this one. Additionally, all of the events will be recorded for you to enjoy at your convenience. You can find out more about these events on our website, nofamass.org/events. And lastly, NOFA's celebrated accreditation course in organic land care will be offered virtually this August. It's the same quality program as the in-person event and complete with online office hours. It will be held evenings twice per week for 4 weeks. And you can find out more information about that at nofa.organiclandcare.net. Thank you again for being a part of the NOFA Mass community, and I look forward to seeing you next time.